Imagine finding out your husband got another woman pregnant after you spent years trying to have a baby. That's what happened to me. After 5 painful years of fertility treatments that drained our savings and broke my heart, I discovered texts on Dimitri's phone. His mistress was 8 months pregnant with his child. But instead of apologizing, he had the nerve to suggest I raise this baby as my own while he continued seeing her behind my back. He even reminded me that this was my only chance at motherhood since my body had failed. I took my own life that night, but then something impossible happened. I woke up 15 years earlier with a chance to rewrite my story. This time I wouldn't be his victim. This time he would regret ever finding me. The text on Dimitri's phone glowed in the darkness of their bedroom. Vivienne Mercer stared at the exchange, her hands trembling. 8 months now. She's kicking like crazy. Can't wait for you to feel her. The sender. Alara. Vivienne scrolled through months of intimate messages, ultrasound photos, and plans that didn't include her. After 5 years of marriage, countless hormone injections, 3 miscarriages, and draining their savings on fertility treatments, her husband had impregnated another woman. When Dimitri returned to their penthouse that evening, Vivienne confronted him with the phone. She expected denial, perhaps even remorse. Instead, Dimitri Valenti, real estate mogul, her supposed soulmate, leaned against their marble kitchen island and offered a business proposal. "This could work in our favor," he said coolly. "You'll raise the child as yours. My investors and business partners respect family men. My reputation stays intact." "And Alara," Vivienne whispered. "She'll be compensated. She understands discretion." His tone was the same he used when acquiring distressed properties. "You want me to raise your mistress's child while you continue seeing her?" Tears streamed down Vivienne's face. Dimitri stepped forward, his cologne suffocating her. "Look at it logically, Vive. You've wanted a child for years. This is your chance." He gestured at her body. "We both know it's not happening the traditional way." Vivienne felt as if she'd been struck. Each word hit harder than any physical blow could have. 5 years of injections, procedures, hope, and disappointment reduced to a clinical failure of her body. Meanwhile, some other woman had effortlessly given Dimitri what Vivienne could not. "Get out," she whispered, too drained to scream. "Just get out." "You're being emotional," Dimitri sighed, straightening his Italian silk tie. "We'll discuss this when you're thinking clearly. I have dinner with investors anyway." After the door closed behind him, Vivienne sat motionless at their kitchen island, tracing the cool marble with her fingertips. The penthouse, their trophy home with its floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the city skyline, suddenly felt like a beautiful prison. Every corner held memories. The living room where they'd celebrated his first major development deal, the balcony where he'd proposed, the bedroom where she'd cried silently after each failed pregnancy test. She wandered through their home, seeing it with new clarity. The photos on the walls told the story of their relationship. Dimitri always slightly angled toward the camera, Vivienne always slightly angled toward him. She had orbited him like a planet around its sun, reflecting his light while having none of her own. Vivienne opened their wine fridge and selected the 1982 Bordeaux they'd been saving for their 5th anniversary, still 2 months away. She uncorked it methodically, retrieving a single crystal glass from their wedding set. In their bedroom, she arranged their wedding photos on the comforter, creating a shrine to the lie she had lived. She placed her engagement ring, a 3-carat emerald-cut diamond that Dimitri had selected because it photographed well for business profiles, in the center. From her nightstand drawer, Vivienne removed the sleeping pills prescribed during her 2nd miscarriage, when grief had made sleep impossible. She lined the amber bottle beside the wine glass like a macabre place setting. For an hour, she wrote. The letter detailed her husband's betrayal, her years of sacrifice, and the final indignity of his proposal, that she raise his mistress's child. She addressed it not just to Dimitri but to his parents, her parents, their friends, anyone who might wonder why. When the letter was sealed in an envelope propped against their wedding portrait, Vivienne poured the wine. She twisted open the pill bottle and emptied its contents into her palm, the small white tablets forming a mountain of escape. She thought of calling someone, Her sister, perhaps, or her college roommate whom she'd gradually lost touch with as Dimitri's schedule demanded more of her time. But what would she say? That she'd constructed her entire life around a man who viewed her as expendable. That she'd become so diminished she couldn't imagine starting over. Instead, Vivienne raised her glass in a silent toast to the skyline, to the city where she'd arrived with such ambition before meeting Dimitri. One by one, she swallowed the pills, washing them down with the wine they'd planned to share in celebration. As drowsiness settled over her, Vivienne lay back against the pillows, surrounded by images of happier times. Her eyelids grew heavy, her breathing slowed. Her final conscious thought was a wish, not for salvation, but for a different path altogether. "I wish I could do it all differently," she whispered into the empty room, then darkness, then a gasping breath. Vivienne bolted upright, heart racing, lungs burning as if she'd been underwater. Panicked, she clutched at her chest, expecting to find herself in a hospital, her stomach being pumped, her choices taken from her yet again. Instead, her hands met soft, worn fabric, a faded university sweatshirt she hadn't seen in over a decade. Disoriented, she blinked rapidly, trying to bring her surroundings into focus. This wasn't her penthouse bedroom with its designer furnishings. This was a small, cluttered studio apartment with posters taped to the walls and textbooks stacked on a pressboard desk. Her desk. Her apartment. From 15 years ago, Vivienne scrambled from the narrow bed, nearly tripping over a laundry basket. She stumbled to the bathroom, a tiny space with cracked tiles and a perpetually dripping faucet that she suddenly remembered with perfect clarity. The face in the mirror stopped her cold. Not the polished, carefully maintained 34-year-old wife of a real estate mogul, but the fresh-faced, slightly round-cheeked 19-year-old college sophomore she had once been. "Impossible," she whispered, touching her reflection. The skin under her fingers felt real. On shaking legs, Vivienne returned to the main room. Her student ID lay on the desk beside an open textbook, Fundamentals of Hospitality Management. The date on a nearby campus newspaper confirmed what the mirror had told her: 2010. 15 years before her suicide. Before she'd ever met Dimitri Valenti, she sank onto the edge of the bed, mind racing. Was this a hallucination, the final firing of neurons in a dying brain? Or had something impossible happened? Had she truly been reborn? A phone she barely remembered owning chimed from the bedside table. A text from her study group about meeting at the library. Normal, ordinary. Real. Vivienne picked up the hospitality textbook, running her fingers over the highlighted passages. She had been studying to enter the hotel industry before switching to real estate to align with Dimitri's interests. "I've been given another chance," she whispered, a slow, disbelieving smile spreading across her face. If this was real, if she truly had another chance, she wouldn't waste it. She wouldn't become Dimitri Valenti's shadow, his accessory, his convenient solution for an inconvenient pregnancy. This time she would become someone he couldn't manipulate, someone he couldn't betray, someone with the power to make him regret ever crossing her path. Vivienne reached for a notebook and began to write, not a suicide letter this time, but a plan. A strategy for the next 15 years. A blueprint for revenge. For 3 days, Vivienne barely left her apartment, convinced she was experiencing an elaborate hallucination before death. But reality remained stubbornly consistent. Her student ID confirmed the date, 2010, 15 years before her suicide. Before she'd ever met Dimitri Valenti, she tested her new reality in small ways. She attended classes she remembered taking a decade and a half ago. She called her parents, who were still living in the small suburban home they would sell 5 years from now. She even pricked her finger with a safety pin, watching the blood well up with detached fascination. When acceptance finally came, it arrived with determination. She researched Dimitri online, finding articles about the 24-year-old wunderkind breaking ground on his first luxury development. In her previous life, they'd meet by chance 3 years from now at an industry function. This time would be different. Vivienne approached her studies with newfound intensity. Her professors noticed the change, commenting on her sudden laser focus and insightful questions that seemed beyond her years. Her classmates attributed the transformation to ambition. They had no way of knowing she was operating with the business acumen of a woman 15 years her senior. At night, alone in her apartment, Vivienne plotted. She charted the city's development over the coming decade, marking neighborhoods that would gentrify, properties that would skyrocket in value, and most importantly, Dimitri's future acquisitions. Her foreknowledge was better than any insider trading tip. It was a complete roadmap to success. She worked 3 jobs: mornings at a coffee shop near campus, evenings as a hotel desk clerk, and weekends bussing tables at an upscale restaurant. Every penny went into savings. She lived on ramen noodles and free coffee, wearing the same clothes until they frayed. After a year of relentless saving, Vivienne approached her Aunt Eleanor, her mother's sister who had always believed in her potential. With practiced precision, Vivienne presented a business plan for purchasing a struggling bed and breakfast in a neighborhood that, in her previous life, had transformed into the city's most desirable district. "This place is in a dump of a neighborhood," Aunt Eleanor observed during their visit to the property. "What do you see that I don't?" "Potential," Vivienne replied. "The university is expanding eastward. In 5 years, this neighborhood will be filled with faculty housing and graduate students." Her aunt studied her with newfound respect. "When did you become so strategic?" "I've been paying attention," Vivienne answered, the partial truth easier than explaining her impossible advantage. With her aunt as cosigner and the family lake house as collateral, Vivienne secured a small business loan. At 21, she became the youngest property owner in the district. The Lavender House bed and breakfast became Vivienne's laboratory. She implemented service standards and design elements she'd observed in luxury hotels during her previous life. She kept meticulous records, demonstrating consistent profit growth that would appeal to future investors. 2 years later, when the neighborhood began showing the first signs of transformation exactly as she'd predicted, Vivienne leveraged the B&B's increased value to purchase a shuttered boutique hotel 3 blocks away. She renamed it Renaissance Plaza, a private nod to her rebirth. Over the next 5 years, Vivienne methodically built her hospitality empire. Each property was strategically positioned in areas she knew would boom, often adjacent to locations where Dimitri would eventually develop. Her hotels featured distinctive period architecture preserved with loving detail, providing a stark contrast to Dimitri's sleek, modern complexes. While Dimitri built flashy developments with cutting-edge amenities, Vivienne's properties offered something his lacked: genuine warmth and impeccable service. She trained her staff personally, instilling an ethos of authentic hospitality that earned her hotels devoted followings and industry recognition. By 27, Vivienne had transformed from uncertain young woman to calculated businesswoman. She moved through the business world with quiet confidence, developing a reputation for uncanny market instincts and uncompromising standards. She studied Dimitri's growing empire from afar, identifying weaknesses in his business model. He expanded too quickly, taking on excessive debt to fund increasingly ambitious projects. He cultivated a celebrity persona, appearing at galas and in business magazines, always with a different model or actress on his arm. Vivienne, meanwhile, remained largely behind the scenes. Her rare interviews focused exclusively on her business philosophy rather than her personal life. She developed relationships with key lenders, city planners, and community organizations, building a foundation of goodwill that contrasted with Dimitri's more transactional approach. At 29, with 8 successful properties in her portfolio, Vivienne had positioned herself perfectly. When she received an invitation to the annual Architectural Heritage Foundation Gala, an event she knew Dimitri never missed, she accepted. For the occasion, Vivienne selected a burgundy silk gown that cascaded down her body like blood. Her stylist had argued for something lighter, more approachable, but Vivienne wanted to make a statement. This wasn't a social appearance. It was the opening move in a long-awaited game. She arrived precisely 45 minutes after the gala began, late enough to make an entrance but not so late as to appear rude. As she glided through the grand ballroom of the Historical Society building, she felt a prickle on the back of her neck. Turning slightly, she caught Dmitri Valenti watching her from across the room. In her previous life, she had found his intensity flattering, mistaking possessiveness for passion. Now she recognized the predatory calculation behind his gaze. He was assessing her worth, measuring her potential value to his image and ambitions. Vivienne accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and circulated through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with city officials and fellow developers. All the while, she remained aware of Dmitri tracking her movements. She allowed him to approach on her terms, timing her pause near a quiet alcove displaying architectural drawings. The sightlines in Burnham's original design were revolutionary, she commented as he stepped beside her, pretending to study the framed sketch. Have we met before? He asked, brow furrowed with déjà vu. Vivienne felt a momentary chill. Could he somehow sense their shared past? No, she realized, it was simply the strange familiarity of meeting someone for the first time. She smiled enigmatically. I believe I would remember meeting Dmitri Valenti. His smile widened, revealing perfect teeth undoubtedly capped at great expense. And you are? Vivienne Mercer, your competition. Dmitri laughed, the sound both genuine and condescending. Competition? I don't recall seeing Mercer on any development permits crossing my desk. Different sector, same city. She sipped her champagne. My properties are the historical renovations you drive past on your way to your construction sites. Recognition dawned. The Renaissance hotels, you're that Mercer. His assessment of her shifted, commercial interest mingling with personal curiosity. Those are impressive properties. Small scale, but impressive. Quality over quantity, Vivienne replied. Though we're expanding steadily, we should discuss potential collaborations. He produced a business card from his tuxedo pocket. My office, perhaps next week. I have some ideas that might interest you. Vivienne accepted the card with a smile that revealed nothing of the triumph surging through her. Perhaps. Though I should warn you, Mr. Valenti, I'm very selective about my partnerships. Call me Dmitri, he insisted. And so am I, Ms. Mercer. So am I. As she moved away into the crowd, Vivienne felt the weight of his gaze following her. The first piece had been positioned on the board. The game she'd waited 15 years to play had finally begun. She wouldn't call him, of course. That wasn't the strategy. He would pursue what he couldn't immediately acquire. It was his nature. And she would use that nature against him, drawing him steadily into a trap of his own making. Dmitri Valenti was accustomed to immediate gratification. When something caught his interest, whether property or person, he acquired it swiftly. Vivienne Mercer proved frustratingly immune to his usual tactics. After their meeting at the gala, Dmitri sent lavish gifts to her office. Rare orchids, vintage champagne, an invitation to his private box at the symphony. Vivienne returned each one with handwritten notes expressing professional appreciation but personal disinterest. Her resistance only intensified his pursuit. He appeared at industry events she attended, engineered accidental meetings at restaurants, and even purchased a property next to her newest hotel development solely to ensure their paths would cross during inspections. Quite a coincidence finding you here, he remarked during one such manufactured encounter, leaning against the construction barrier separating their properties. Vivienne glanced up from her clipboard unfazed. Is it? You've been leaving breadcrumbs across the city for weeks. His smile faltered slightly, unused to having his tactics named so directly. Most women appreciate persistence. I'm not most women, she replied, turning back to her foreman. And I'm working. What Vivienne never revealed was how deeply satisfying his pursuit had become. Every desperate attempt to capture her attention was a reverse image of her former life, where she had been the one eagerly seeking his approval, his affection, his time. The power shift was intoxicating. 3 months into his pursuit, Vivienne finally accepted a dinner invitation. She chose the restaurant, an intimate French bistro rather than the flashy steakhouse he'd suggested. Over Kobe beef and aged whiskey, she observed how little he'd changed, or rather, how similar he was to the man she'd eventually marry. Confident to the point of arrogance. Charismatic when it served him. Utterly convinced of his invincibility. Why the sudden change of heart? Dmitri asked, refilling her glass. Professional curiosity, Vivienne replied. Your West Side development is impressive. Just professional. His smile held the same predatory edge she remembered. For now. She matched his smile with equal calculation. As Vivienne gradually allowed Dmitri deeper into her life, she began mapping the infrastructure of his business empire. She identified his financial weaknesses, the pattern of his land acquisitions, and most importantly, the corners he cut to maximize profit margins. She discovered that while Dimitri's developments appeared spectacular on the surface, they were plagued with hidden compromises. Cheaper materials substituted after inspections, environmental regulations sidestepped through political connections, safety features minimized to cut costs. Each revelation was carefully documented in an encrypted file she simply named Legacy. Not just for revenge, she reasoned, but for protection. Knowing Dimitri's methods would help her avoid becoming collateral damage when his shortcuts inevitably caused problems. 4 months into their carefully orchestrated relationship, Dmitri invited Vivienne to the grand opening of his latest luxury condominium tower. As they mingled with investors and city officials, his proprietary hand on the small of her back announced to everyone present that Vivienne Mercer was now in Dmitri Valenti's orbit. You look pleased with yourself, she observed as they sipped champagne on the rooftop terrace. I've just closed 3 deals tonight, he replied, his gaze sweeping over the glittering cityscape like a conquering emperor. And I'm here with the most intriguing woman in the room. Intriguing? You're different from anyone I've dated before. His eyes narrowed slightly. Sometimes I feel like you know me better than you should. A flutter of alarm passed through Vivienne. Had she revealed too much? I pay attention, she said carefully. It's how I've survived in a male-dominated industry. Dmitri seemed satisfied with this explanation. You're a survivor, I respect that. If only he knew how true that statement was. At a business dinner 6 months into their relationship, Dmitri introduced her to his closest friend and business partner, Alexander Ruzik. Where Dmitri was all sharp edges and calculated charm, Alexander surprised Vivienne with his genuine warmth. As development partners, they balanced each other, Dimitri's aggressive vision tempered by Alexander's methodical execution. Forgive my friend's intensity, Alexander told her when Dmitri stepped away to greet investors at a neighboring table. He sees something he wants and forgets people aren't properties to be acquired. And what do you see when you look at me? Vivienne asked. Alexander considered her thoughtfully. Someone playing a game I don't quite understand yet. For the first time since her rebirth, Vivienne felt truly seen and unexpectedly intrigued. What makes you think I'm playing a game? She asked, maintaining her composure despite the unnerving accuracy of his observation. The way you watch him when he's not looking at you, Alexander replied. Not with affection but with assessment. I recognize it because I've caught myself doing the same thing over the years. Vivienne found herself momentarily without a scripted response. You're very perceptive. I'm not judging, he added quickly. Dmitri is complicated, and you seem capable of handling complications. Their conversation was interrupted by Dimitri's return, but Vivienne found herself watching Alexander throughout the remainder of dinner. He was quieter than Dmitri, more observant. While Dmitri commanded the room's attention, Alexander noticed details. A server's empty water pitcher, an investor's wife feeling excluded from conversation, Vivienne's momentary discomfort when Dmitri mentioned having children someday. After dinner, as they waited for the valet to bring their cars, Alexander handed Vivienne his business card. Unlike Dimitri's flashy embossed version, Alexander's was simple, elegant. If you ever need a different perspective on a development question, he said casually, though his eyes conveyed deeper meaning. Vivienne tucked the card into her clutch. I'll keep that in mind. As their relationship progressed, Vivienne carefully calibrated her responses to Dimitri's increasing possessiveness. She accepted some invitations, declined others, maintaining the illusion of independence while allowing him to believe he was steadily winning her over. She discovered that the pleasure of watching Dimitri pursue her was gradually being matched by a different satisfaction, identifying the moments when his mask slipped, revealing the man she had ultimately married in her previous life. When a contractor questioned one of Dimitri's design changes during a site visit, Vivienne witnessed the cold fury that flashed across his face before he smoothed it into reasonable disagreement. When a waitress spilled water on his sleeve at dinner, she saw the momentary contempt that hardened his features before he waved off her apologies with performative graciousness. These glimpses confirmed what she already knew. The charming, driven, ambitious man courting her was the same one who would eventually impregnate another woman and expect his wife to raise the child as a solution to a public relations problem. 8 months into their relationship, Dimitri invited Vivienne to accompany him on a business trip to Miami. They stayed in a lavish oceanfront suite, attended meetings with potential investors, and dined at exclusive restaurants. To anyone observing, they appeared to be the perfect power couple, beautiful, successful, complementary. On their final evening, walking along the moonlit beach, Dimitri stopped and turned to face her. "I've never brought anyone on a business trip before," he said, his voice uncharacteristically serious. "My life doesn't usually allow for distractions." "Am I a distraction?" Vivienne asked, knowing her role in the script. "That's what's strange," he replied, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "You're the opposite. You make me sharper, more focused." He paused, seeming to search for words. "I think we could build something extraordinary together." The sincerity in his voice momentarily transported Vivienne back to their first relationship, to the man she had fallen in love with before disillusionment set in. For a dangerous moment, she felt herself wavering. Was she being fair? Could people change? Was the Dimitri before her genuinely different from the one who had betrayed her? Then he continued, "Your hotels, my developments, imagine the portfolio we could create, the market dominance." And just like that, the spell was broken. Even in this intimate moment, Dimitri saw their relationship primarily as a beneficial merger and acquisition strategy. "Are you proposing a business partnership or something more?" she asked carefully. His smile carried the confidence of a man unaccustomed to rejection. "Both eventually. But let's start with pleasure before business." Later that night, when Dimitri pulled her towards him in their suite, Vivienne allowed herself to respond with calculated passion. Physical intimacy was an inevitable step in her plan, a necessary risk in maintaining the illusion of a developing relationship. As she lay awake afterward, watching Dimitri sleep beside her, Vivienne felt strangely detached. The body lying next to her belonged to a man she had once loved desperately, a man she had planned to spend her life with. Now he was simultaneously a stranger and the most familiar person in her world, a paradox only she could understand. Tomorrow they would return to the city, and the next phase of her plan would begin. Allowing Dimitri to believe he had conquered the final frontier of her resistance would make him complacent, convinced of his victory. And complacency, Vivienne knew, would make him vulnerable. 1 year into their relationship, Dimitri proposed at the opening of his newest skyscraper. The Valenti Vista stood 60 stories above the city, its glass facade reflecting clouds and sky. As champagne flowed and investors congratulated him on another architectural triumph, Dimitri led Vivienne to the outdoor terrace overlooking the cityscape. Cameras flashed as he dropped to one knee, presenting a 3-carat emerald-cut diamond, identical to the ring from Vivienne's previous life. The sense of déjà vu nearly suffocated her. "Vivienne Mercer," he announced, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, "you challenge me, inspire me, and make me better. Build your future with mine." It wasn't a question but a command cloaked in romantic language. The assembled guests, business partners, society reporters, city officials watched expectantly. This was as much a business merger announcement as a proposal. Yes, she whispered, knowing this acceptance was the key that would unlock his complete trust and his eventual destruction. The ring slid onto her finger with familiar weight. As Dmitri embraced her, cameras captured the perfect moment. Successful developer and his elegant fiancée silhouetted against the glittering skyline. The photo would appear in business journals and society pages with captions about power couples and real estate dynasties. Only Vivienne recognized the irony. The scene was nearly identical to their first engagement, down to the calculated public setting and the precise model of ring. Dmitri wasn't just predictable. He was following an exact script with a different actress in the leading role. As Dmitri's fiancée, Vivienne gained unprecedented access to his business operations. She discovered the full extent of his unethical practices: bribery of city officials for expedited permits, dangerous construction shortcuts that wouldn't become apparent for years, tax evasion schemes involving offshore accounts. She documented everything meticulously. During late nights in his office while he attended social functions, Vivienne copied files, photographed documents, and recorded conversations with his business associates. She established a secure digital vault that contained enough evidence to destroy both his reputation and his company. The most valuable discovery came during a late dinner at his penthouse office. After discussing wedding venues over takeout from an exclusive restaurant, Dmitri revealed architectural models for Valenti Vision, his master plan for a 25-year development that would transform the city's waterfront and cement his legacy. "This stays between us," he cautioned, spreading blueprints across his desk. "The acquisition phase is delicate. If competitors learn my strategy, land prices will skyrocket." Vivienne studied the ambitious plan with genuine admiration. Despite everything, Dmitri possessed undeniable vision. The multi-phase development would create a new district combining residential towers, office spaces, and cultural venues around a central park. "It's incredible," she admitted truthfully. "Our legacy now," he corrected himself, kissing her hand. "The first building will break ground next year. By the time we have children, the initial phase will be complete. Our family will grow alongside our city's transformation." Children. The word sent a cold shiver through Vivienne, reminding her of fertility treatments, miscarriages, and ultimately the child another woman would carry. She forced a smile, tucking the pain away. That same week, Dmitri introduced Vivienne to his new executive assistant, Alara Navarro. The woman who would have been his mistress in another lifetime smiled politely, completely unaware of their twisted connection. "She has an MBA from Wharton and interned with Goldman Sachs," Dmitri explained as they walked away from Alara's desk. "I stole her from Winston Development with a salary they couldn't match. She's brilliant with numbers," Dmitri continued later, loosening his tie as they entered his apartment. "And looks gorgeous in a boardroom. Clients respond well to her." Vivienne recognized his tone, the same appraising assessment he'd once used to describe her. Some patterns never changed. She watched Alara carefully over the following weeks, looking for signs of attraction between her and Dmitri. There were none yet. Alara maintained strict professionalism. But Vivienne noticed how Dmitri's eyes followed the younger woman when she left rooms, how he found excuses to have her attend meetings where her presence wasn't strictly necessary. As wedding plans accelerated, Vivienne's professional relationship with Alexander deepened. They found themselves frequently collaborating on projects where Valenti Developments and Renaissance Properties had overlapping interests. During project site visits and planning meetings, they discovered shared values about ethical business practices. She found herself revealing more of her genuine thoughts to him than to Dmitri. "Your fiancé wants to reduce the affordable housing units in the Riverside project," Alexander mentioned during one such meeting, his tone carefully neutral. Vivienne frowned. The city approval was contingent on those units. "He believes the fines would cost less than the profit loss." Alexander slid a document across the table. I disagree, both financially and ethically. His analysis showed that maintaining the affordable units while enhancing amenities would actually increase the property's overall value by attracting a more diverse tenant base and qualifying for additional tax incentives. This is impressive work, Vivienne said, genuinely surprised by the thoroughness of his approach. Dmitri has vision, but sometimes he takes unnecessary risks for marginal gains. Alexander's voice held no judgment, merely observation. He sees 5 years ahead. I prefer looking at the 20-year impact. That evening, Vivienne attended a company celebration at Valenti Development's headquarters. She watched from across the room as Dmitri charmed investors and joked with employees. His natural charisma was undeniable. He remembered names, referenced personal details, made each person feel momentarily special. Then she caught him flirting with Alara during a quiet moment by the bar, his hand lingering too long on her lower back, his body angled toward hers, his voice dropping to that intimate register Vivienne knew so well. Vivienne sought out Alexander, finding him observing the same interaction from a corner of the room. Does he do this often? She asked, nodding toward Dmitri. Alexander's expression tightened. I've tried speaking to him about professionalism. He doesn't listen. Why do you stay partners with him? Our visions aligned once, Alexander said quietly. And legally, our businesses are too intertwined to separate easily. He studied her face with unexpected intensity. The better question might be why you're marrying him when you see the same things I do. The directness of his question caught Vivienne off guard. She became so focused on her long game that she rarely had to justify her relationship with Dmitri to others. People are complicated, she finally answered. Dmitri has qualities I appreciate, and qualities you don't. It wasn't a question that night as she rode home alone in the back of a taxi while Dmitri stayed behind to close a deal with investors. Vivienne found herself at a crossroads. Her plan had always been straightforward: gain access, gather evidence, execute revenge. But Alexander's question lingered. What if there were other ways to achieve justice without entangling herself further with Dmitri? The next morning, Vivienne made a decision. She called Alexander and proposed meeting privately at her office. When he arrived, she closed the door and activated a signal jammer, a precaution against listening devices she'd begun taking since her engagement to Dmitri. What I'm about to suggest involves significant risk, she began without preamble. I need to know where your loyalties lie. Alexander's eyebrows rose slightly. That depends on what you're suggesting. A confidential partnership, Vivienne said carefully. I've been documenting certain activities within Valenti developments that concern me, practices that could have serious legal and financial consequences. Understanding dawned in his eyes. You're not just the devoted fiancé you appear to be. And you're not just the loyal business partner, she countered. We both see the ethical compromises, the corners being cut. The question is, what are we prepared to do about it? For a long moment, Alexander sat silently, his expression unreadable. Vivienne had taken an enormous gamble, revealing even this much of her hand. I helped build this company, he finally said. I've invested a decade of my life in it, but lately I've been unable to recognize the values it represents. He met her gaze directly. What exactly are you proposing? Together, we document everything: the permit bribes, the material substitutions, the labor violations. We prepare contingencies for our own businesses to weather the fallout. And when the time is right, we act. You're talking about bringing down your fiancé's company, Alexander said slowly. The company you're set to have a stake in through marriage. I'm talking about accountability, Vivienne replied. Something Dmitri has always considered optional. What began as strategic alliance transformed gradually into genuine connection. Alexander brought Vivienne documentation of questionable practices dating back years, files he'd kept as insurance but never had the leverage to use. She shared her insights into Dmitri's future plans, carefully omitting how she'd acquired such detailed knowledge. They worked closely over the following months, their alliance strengthening through shared purpose. 6 months before the wedding, during a late night reviewing construction permits in her office, Alexander paused their work with an unexpected question. "Why are you still going through with the wedding?" he asked. "We have enough evidence already." Vivienne considered how much to reveal. "Timing," she finally said. "Maximum impact requires perfect timing, and it has nothing to do with feelings you might still have for him." The question was gentle but direct. Vivienne looked up, startled by its perceptiveness. "No," she said firmly. "Any feelings I had died a long time ago." Their eyes held for a weighted moment. Then Alexander moved closer, his intent clear but his approach hesitant, giving her every opportunity to step away. Instead, Vivienne closed the distance between them. The kiss was nothing like Dimitri's calculated passion. It was tentative at first, then increasingly certain, an honest connection that shocked her with its intensity. "This is dangerous," he whispered against her lips. "Everything worth doing is," she replied. Afterward, as they sat on her office couch, the city lights twinkling beyond the windows, Vivienne felt an unfamiliar emotion, genuine happiness. Not the satisfaction of revenge progressing, but simple human connection. "What happens after?" Alexander asked, his arm around her shoulders. "After Dimitri, after the company?" For the first time since her rebirth, Vivienne found herself considering a future beyond her revenge. A future with possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to imagine. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've been focused on the end goal for so long, I haven't thought much about what comes next." Alexander's smile held no judgment. "Maybe that's something we could figure out together." The day before her wedding, Vivienne confirmed the final piece of her plan. Through a complex network of shell corporations, she had quietly acquired controlling interest in Dimitri's company. 51% of voting shares secured through leveraged assets and strategic investors. Simultaneously, she provided regulatory authorities with evidence of his financial crimes, timed to coincide with her wedding day revelation. She sat in her office reviewing the documentation one last time. The contracts were ironclad, the transfer of ownership complete. Tomorrow, Dimitri Valenti would discover that the woman he thought he owned had actually acquired him. The intercom buzzed, her assistant announcing her doctor's appointment. Vivienne had almost forgotten. For the past 3 weeks, she'd experienced persistent fatigue and nausea. Initially, she attributed it to wedding stress, but when the symptoms persisted, she reluctantly scheduled a checkup. 2 hours later, Vivienne sat stunned in her car in the hospital parking garage. The doctor's words echoed in her mind. "Congratulations, Ms. Mercer. You're approximately 8 weeks pregnant. Pregnant with Alexander's child." The miracle that had eluded her in her previous life had happened naturally, without medical intervention, with a man who truly valued her. She pressed her palm against her still flat stomach, overwhelmed by emotions she hadn't anticipated. Throughout her rebirth, revenge had been her primary focus, consuming her thoughts and driving her actions. Now suddenly, new life complicated everything. For a moment she considered calling Alexander. Their relationship had deepened over the past months, evolving from strategic alliance to genuine attachment. But revealing her pregnancy now on the eve of her public takedown of Dimitri would only complicate matters. There would be time for personal joy after justice was served. As she prepared for the rehearsal dinner that evening, Dimitri called. "Cold feet?" he teased. "Never," Vivienne replied truthfully. "Tomorrow will be unforgettable." The dinner passed in a blur of champagne toasts she pretended to drink in congratulations that rang hollow in her ears. Dimitri was at his charismatic best, charming her parents, impressing her friends, playing the role of devoted groom with Oscar-worthy conviction. Only Alexander, seated at the far end of the table, seemed to recognize the performance for what it was. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded room, a silent communication passing between them. Tomorrow would change everything. The wedding day dawned perfect, clear skies, gentle breeze, ideal conditions for the rooftop ceremony at Dimitri's flagship hotel. 300 guests, including business elites, investors, and journalists, assembled in the grand ballroom for pre-ceremony cocktails. Vivienne watched from a hidden alcove as Dimitri greeted guests, his expression smug with triumph. He thought he'd won her. He had no idea she'd rewritten the game entirely. In the bridal suite, instead of donning the designer gown hanging on the door, Vivienne dressed in a precisely tailored white business suit. Her bridesmaids, actually her senior management team, helped her prepare not for a wedding but for the most important business presentation of her life. The regulatory agents are in position, her chief financial officer confirmed. SEC, IRS, and the district attorney's office have representatives attending as guests. And the presentation. Loaded and tested. The screens are programmed to activate on your signal. Vivienne nodded, checking her reflection one final time. Then let's not keep our guests waiting. When the ceremony should have begun, the wedding planner instead directed guests to the grand ballroom for a special presentation from the bride. Confusion rippled through the crowd as large screens descended from the ceiling. Dimitri stood at the front, bewildered, as Vivienne appeared on stage in her white suit. "Thank you all for coming to witness this union," she began. "Though not the union you expected." The screens illuminated with corporate documents showing Vivienne's majority ownership of Valenti Developments. "As the new controlling shareholder of this company, I'm legally obligated to disclose significant issues affecting its valuation." The screens shifted to evidence of Dimitri's fraudulent practices. Representatives from the Financial Crimes Division are here today to address these concerning findings. Pandemonium erupted. Investors rushed for exits. Journalists frantically took notes. And Dimitri, his face contorted with rage and disbelief, stormed toward the stage. Security personnel stepped forward, blocking his path. These weren't the hotel's regular staff but private security Vivienne had arranged specifically for this moment, anticipating Dimitri's reaction. "You can't do this," he growled when he reached the foot of the stage, held back by two guards. "Everything I built was built on lies," Vivienne finished. "Just like our relationship." The screens displayed evidence of permit violations, tax fraud, and unsafe construction practices, all meticulously documented over the past year. The Valenti Vision waterfront development has been built on fraudulent permits and substandard materials, Vivienne explained to the shocked audience. The foundations of 3 buildings are already showing stress fractures that have been concealed from inspectors. Dimitri lunged forward, breaking free momentarily before being restrained again. "This is slander. These are fabrications." "Every document has been verified," Vivienne continued calmly. "Every allegation substantiated by multiple sources, including your business partner." On cue, Alexander stepped forward from the crowd. The betrayal registered on Dimitri's face as realization dawned. "You too," Dimitri's voice cracked. "My best friend." "I tried to guide you back to ethical practices for years," Alexander said quietly. "You stopped listening a long time ago." "Why?" Dimitri asked, his attention returning to Vivienne, his voice barely audible over the commotion in the ballroom. "What did I ever do to you?" Vivienne stepped to the edge of the stage, close enough to see the confusion and pain in his eyes. For a fleeting moment, she felt a twinge of remorse. Not for her actions, but for the necessity of them. "In this lifetime, nothing yet, but I've seen who you truly are." Before he could respond, she gestured off stage. Alexander walked up the steps, standing beside her. "I'm pregnant, Dimitri," she said calmly. "With Alexander's child." Dimitri's expression collapsed from rage to devastation. "You and my best friend." He saw me as a person, not a possession. Not just arm candy for investors or someone to raise your child while you continued your affairs. Dimitri's head snapped up. "What are you talking about? What child?" Vivienne leaned close, whispering words only he could hear. "In another life you asked me to raise your mistress's child. In this one I'll raise my child with someone worthy, while you watch your legacy disappear." She straightened up, addressing the confused audience once more. "Valenti Developments will continue operations under new management focused on ethical business practices and community investment. All current projects will be independently assessed for safety and compliance issues." As security escorted a shouting Dimitri from his own building, Vivienne felt Alexander's hand slip into hers. She had waited 15 years for this moment of justice. It tasted both sweeter and more bittersweet than she had imagined. News cameras captured the scene as Dmitri was led through the lobby, his perfect image crumbling in real time. Society reporters who had arrived expecting to document a power couple's wedding were instead witnessing the fall of one of the city's most prominent developers. Later that evening, after statements had been given to authorities and the last shocked guests had departed, Vivienne and Alexander stood alone on the hotel's rooftop terrace where the ceremony should have taken place. "Are you okay?" he asked, studying her face in the fading light. "I think so," she answered honestly. "It's been a long road to this moment. You never told me why," Alexander said quietly. "Why you targeted Dmitri so specifically. Why you were willing to spend years of your life orchestrating his downfall." Vivienne considered her answer carefully. How could she explain her rebirth, her second chance, her knowledge of a future that would never now come to pass? Some truths were too extraordinary to share, even with someone she trusted. "Let's just say I had a premonition about the man he would become," she finally replied. "And I couldn't let that future unfold." Alexander seemed to accept this cryptic explanation. "And the pregnancy, was that part of the plan too?" Vivienne shook her head, placing her hand protectively over her stomach. "No, that was the universe's idea apparently." His smile was cautious but hopeful. "Are you happy about it?" "In my other life," Vivienne caught herself. "I mean, in my previous plans for my life, a child was always what I wanted most. It just never seemed possible." Alexander covered her hand with his. "And now I think perhaps the future holds more possibilities than I allowed myself to imagine." As daylight faded and the city lights began to twinkle below them, Vivienne felt something she hadn't experienced since her rebirth. A sense of openness, of unwritten possibilities. For so long, her path had been defined by the single-minded pursuit of justice. Now that justice had been served, she stood at the threshold of a life unplanned, unscripted. It was terrifying and exhilarating. "What happens tomorrow?" Alexander asked. Vivienne turned to face him fully. "Tomorrow we begin rebuilding what Dmitri tried to destroy, a company based on integrity. And perhaps," she added, allowing herself a genuine smile, "we start building something new for ourselves as well." The irony wasn't lost on her. In her first life, Dmitri had expected her to raise his child with another woman while maintaining appearances. In this second chance, she would raise a child with the man Dmitri had trusted most, while Dmitri's carefully constructed facade crumbled around him. Justice, Vivienne decided, had a poetry all its own. 1 year later, Vivienne stood on the rooftop garden of what had been Dmitri's flagship building, now the headquarters of Mercer Ruzic Developments. In her arms, 4-month-old Sophia cooed at the sunset, painting the city skyline in shades of gold and amber. The past year had unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony reaching its crescendo. Dmitri faced multiple federal indictments for fraud, tax evasion, and bribery. His reputation, the thing he valued above all, lay in tatters. The empire he'd built had been restructured under Vivienne and Alexander's leadership, with emphasis on ethical development and community investment. Their marriage 3 months after the non-wedding scandal had been a private affair. Just family and trusted friends gathering at Vivienne's first boutique hotel, the one she'd purchased as a struggling bed and breakfast in her second chance at life. The media had feasted on the story for weeks. Developer's fiancé exposes fraud, marries his business partner. Eventually, as Dmitri's legal troubles deepened and the evidence against him proved insurmountable, the narrative shifted. Industry publications praised Vivienne and Alexander for their ethical stand, while business schools developed case studies on the importance of corporate governance and transparency. Vivienne had taken satisfaction in watching justice unfold, but found greater fulfillment in the work of transformation. The Valenti Vision waterfront development, once designed to glorify a single man's ambition, had been reimagined as a mixed-use district emphasizing affordable housing, green spaces, and community facilities alongside luxury elements. Sophia gurgled, reaching for a butterfly that had landed on a nearby flowering shrub. At 4 months, she already showed the alertness and curiosity that both her parents possessed. Her tiny features were a perfect blend of Vivienne and Alexander, his dark hair and thoughtful eyes, her determined chin and expressive mouth. "Showing our daughter the kingdom?" Alexander asked, joining them at the railing. He wrapped his arms around them both, his wedding band catching the fading light. "Teaching her about second chances," Vivienne replied. Alexander still didn't know the full truth of her rebirth. Some experiences were too extraordinary to share completely. But he understood the essence, that Vivienne had somehow known exactly who Dmitri was beneath his charismatic facade. "I saw Dmitri on the news today," Alexander said quietly. "The court date is set for next month." Vivienne nodded. She'd expected to feel triumphant watching Dmitri's downfall, but her emotions had evolved beyond simple revenge. What she felt instead was gratitude for this second chance, not just to right a wrong, but to create something genuinely meaningful. The criminal proceedings against Dmitri had exposed the full extent of his fraudulent practices. 3 buildings had required extensive structural reinforcement to address safety issues he'd concealed. Hundreds of homeowners had discovered their luxury condominiums contained substandard materials beneath the high-end finishes. Tax authorities had uncovered offshore accounts and shell companies designed to hide millions in unreported income. Yet even as she monitored the legal proceedings, Vivienne found herself increasingly focused on the future rather than the past. The company she and Alexander had built from the remains of Valenti Developments was becoming known for innovation in sustainable design and community-oriented development. Their reputation for ethical business practices attracted partners and investors who shared their values. "Do you ever regret how things happened?" Alexander asked. It wasn't the first time he'd questioned the morality of their actions, even while acknowledging Dmitri's crimes. "I regret that it was necessary," Vivienne answered honestly. "But not that we did it." She kissed Sophia's forehead. "Some prices are worth paying for the right future." The question of morality had haunted Vivienne during quiet moments throughout the past year. Had she been justified in orchestrating Dmitri's downfall based on actions he had not yet committed in this timeline? Was her foreknowledge a responsibility or merely a tool for revenge? She had reconciled these questions by focusing on the tangible good that had resulted from her actions. Buildings were safer. Workers received fair wages. Communities benefited from development that considered their needs rather than merely exploiting their land. And a child, her child, would grow up in a world where at least one corrupt influence had been neutralized. "I've been thinking about expanding the Renaissance Foundation," Vivienne said, changing the subject. "Specifically focusing on fertility support for couples who can't afford treatment." Alexander studied her face, recognizing the personal significance behind the suggestion. Though Vivienne had never explicitly discussed fertility struggles, he'd pieced together enough from her occasional comments to understand this was an area of personal importance. "That seems like a worthy cause," he replied. "We could partner with research hospitals, maybe establish a grant program." This was what Vivienne treasured most about their partnership. The seamless way they built upon each other's ideas, enhancing rather than competing. So different from her relationship with Dmitri, where every decision had ultimately served his vision, his priorities. As twilight deepened around them, Vivienne reflected on both her lives, the pain of her first existence and the hard-won joy of her second. The betrayal that had once destroyed her had ultimately led to this moment of peace. She had transformed from victim to architect of her own destiny. Sophia grabbed at the pendant around Vivienne's neck, a small emerald cushioned between 2 diamonds. "That's right, little one," Vivienne whispered. "Sometimes we have to break before we can be reborn into something stronger." The pendant was Vivienne's private symbol of her journey, the emerald representing growth and renewal, the diamonds symbolizing the pressure and hardship that had transformed her. "She's getting tired," Alexander observed as Sophia's eyelids began to droop. "Should we head home?" Home was a renovated brownstone in a historic district. nothing like the sleek, sterile penthouse she had shared with Dmitri in her previous life. This home had worn wooden floors that creaked slightly, windows that occasionally stuck, and a garden where Sophia would someday play. It was imperfect and entirely theirs. "Let's stay a few more minutes," Vivienne suggested. "It's not often we get moments this peaceful." The company had demanded much of their attention over the past year, restructuring Dimitri's operations while maintaining their own business interests had meant long hours and difficult decisions. There had been lawsuits from investors, complaints from contractors, and the complex task of identifying which projects could be salvaged and which needed to be abandoned. Through it all, they had maintained a united front, their partnership strengthened by shared purpose and mutual respect. And at the center of everything, growing steadily beneath Vivienne's heart and then in their arms, Sophia had provided perspective that no business challenge could overshadow. "I received an interesting offer today," Alexander mentioned, his tone carefully neutral. "The Urban Development Council wants me to head their ethics committee." "You should accept," Vivienne said immediately. "You'd be perfect for it. It would mean less time for the company. The company will benefit from the connection. Besides," she added with a smile, "I think we've proven we work well individually and even better together." Beyond the city skyline, stars began appearing one by one, like possibilities in an endless universe of second chances. Sophia had fallen asleep against Vivienne's shoulder, her tiny hand still clutching the pendant. Vivienne thought about the woman she had been in her first life, devoted to Dmitri, desperate for his approval, willing to define herself through his vision. That woman seemed like a stranger now, a cautionary tale rather than a past self. In this life, she had built success on her own terms. She had found love based on mutual respect rather than possession. She had created a child from joy rather than obligation. And perhaps most importantly, she had discovered that true justice wasn't about punishment but about creating something better from the ashes of what had been destroyed. "Penny for your thoughts," Alexander said softly, not wanting to wake Sophia. "I was thinking about parallel lives," Vivienne replied. "About how different things might have been if I'd made other choices." "Regrets?" "No," she said with quiet certainty. "Appreciation for where I am now, for who I'm with." As they turned to leave the rooftop garden, Vivienne cast one final glance at the city spread before them. Somewhere in that urban landscape, Dmitri was preparing for his trial, his empire crumbled, his reputation destroyed. She felt no satisfaction in his suffering, only a sense of completion. The circle that had begun with her rebirth had closed. What awaited her now was uncharted territory, a future not shaped by the ghost of a past life, but by choices made in this one. A future with Alexander and Sophia, with their company and foundation, with possibilities she had never dared imagine during those dark days after discovering Dimitri's betrayal. This was her true rebirth, not the miraculous second chance that had returned her to her younger self, but the life she had built from that opportunity. A life where she hadn't merely avoided suffering but had discovered joy. A life where the final laugh wasn't about revenge, but about creating something that would outlast any victory over a single adversary.